A woman in a plain white dress climbed a wooden scaffold in front of a screaming crowd. Her hair had been cut short. Her hands were bound behind her. She was 37 years old, and the people watching her did not see a person. It was October 16, 1793. They saw a creature they had been taught to hate for 4 years, a foreign whore, an incestuous mother, a sexual monster who drained the treasury between her legs. None of it was true. But by the time Marie Antoinette mounted those steps, the truth no longer mattered. A different woman had been built in the public imagination, brick by filthy brick, pamphlet by pamphlet, engraving by engraving. And that woman, not the real one, was the one being executed. This is the story of how a print campaign, decades in the making, didn't just criticize a queen. It manufactured a monster, used her body as a battlefield, and left behind a myth so durable that even today, most people know something about Marie Antoinette that she never said and never did. The cake quote is the least of it. The real story is darker and far more deliberate. She arrived in France in 1770, 14 years old, sent from the Austrian court to marry the future Louis XVI and seal an alliance between two empires that had spent centuries at war. The French called the arrangement the Austrian marriage, and many never forgave her for it. She was a foreigner the moment she crossed the border, and in the political culture of pre-revolutionary France, foreign-born queens had always been useful scapegoats. Marie Antoinette was attacked and demeaned through satire and caricature in a ferocious outpouring of French revolutionary print culture, but the groundwork for that hatred was laid years before any revolution began. She didn't choose her marriage. She didn't choose her nationality. She didn't choose to be young, awkward, and thrust into the most ritualized, watched court in Europe, where every gesture was scrutinized and every silence filled in by gossip. Versailles ran on rumor the way modern cities run on electricity. A girl who didn't yet speak the language fluently, who missed her mother, who fumbled court etiquette, was simply raw material, and France's pamphleteers had been sharpening their knives for decades before she gave them a reason. To understand what happened to Marie Antoinette, you have to understand the machine that was already running before she arrived. French cities in the 1780s were awash with a crude form of literature called libelles, pamphlets ranging from political fiction to outright pornography that attacked royals, nobles, and politicians, undermining their authority. These libelles contained vulgar, defamatory stories with little or no truth behind them, yet that never stopped publishers or the largely working-class readers who devoured them. This was not new invention for the Revolution. It was an established genre, a black market of reputation assassination that had existed under the Ancien regime for years. Attacking the queen was also a convenient way of attacking the king without doing so directly. Criticizing Louis XVI was treason. Mocking his wife's body was, for a long time, merely scandalous. The libelles were sold furtively, passed hand to hand, read aloud in cafés to people who couldn't read themselves. They were the 18th century's viral content, and queens, conveniently embodying both sex and state, were the perfect target. Why did the libelles converge on one woman so overwhelmingly? The queen, being female, of foreign birth, fond of fashion, slow to produce a royal heir, and famously strong-willed, was an easy target for satirists and pornographers. Every one of those traits, on its own, was survivable. Together, they made her irresistible copy. A foreign queen who took years to conceive an heir fed rumors of impotence in the king and infidelity in her. A fashionable queen who spent on dresses and jewels became a symbol of aristocratic excess to a population staring down bread shortages. A strong-willed queen who occasionally voiced opinions to her husband became, in the hands of pamphleteers, a manipulative foreign agent steering French policy toward Vienna. None of these traits made her a villain. They made her a symbol that propagandists could load with whatever meaning served their purpose. The libelles didn't need facts. They needed a recognizable face onto which existing anxieties about gender, about foreignness, about wealth could be mapped. She had the misfortune of fitting the silhouette perfectly. In 1785, a scandal erupted that had nothing to do with the Queen's actual behavior and everything to do with her reputation. A pamphlet culture against the monarchy already existed before her marriage, but the diamond necklace affair caused a surge that significantly intensified the campaign against her in the 1780s. A con artist named Jean de la Motte forged letters from the Queen and convinced a cardinal to purchase an outrageously expensive diamond necklace on her behalf, pocketing the money herself. Marie Antoinette had nothing to do with the scheme. She had actually refused to buy the necklace years earlier. But the public didn't hear the Queen was a victim of fraud. They heard the Queen and diamonds and secret letters and a cardinal in her bedroom at night. The court trial that followed, intended to clear her name, instead cemented an image, a woman who lived in a tangle of secret assignations, who could plausibly be imagined doing anything with anyone behind palace walls. The truth was almost irrelevant. The shape of the scandal was what stuck. By the late 1780s, what had been gossip became industry. Between 1787 and 1792, there were important precursors that would shape the direction of revolutionary erotic libel against the Queen, even though all political elites, royalist and revolutionary alike, received their share of pornographic censure. But the imbalance was staggering. Historian Robert Darnton wrote that the avalanche of defamation that overwhelmed Marie Antoinette between 1789 and her execution in 1793 has no parallel in the history of vilification. This wasn't political satire in the conventional sense, cartoons mocking a leader's policies. This was something closer to what we'd now call coordinated character assassination through sexual content, mass-produced and mass-distributed in a society without any concept of media regulation, libel law enforcement for the poor against the powerful, or public relations. The Queen had no mechanism to respond. She could not sue. She could not hold a press conference. She could only watch, or refuse to watch, as an alternate version of herself multiplied across the printing presses of Paris and the Netherlands, where many of the most explicit titles were produced beyond French jurisdiction. What did these libelles actually say? One of the earliest, Les Amours de Charlot and Antoinette, published in 1779, imagined the Queen's secret life as a sex-starved wife married to an impotent husband. It depicted her as a wanton woman, unsatisfied by a passionless king, describing his anatomy in crude verse and accusing him of being sexually dominated rather than dominant. Smutty pamphlets dubbed her l'Autrichienne, the Austrian bitch, and accused her of adultery, cuckoldry, lesbianism, masturbation, and incest, alongside claims that she manipulated the king and spied for Austria. The historian's verdict on this material is unambiguous. There was a little truth in accounts of her political activism, since she did comment on matters to her husband, but the stories of her sexual conduct were an outrageous fiction. If she was sexually active outside her marriage, she concealed it remarkably well. In other words, the one allegation with any factual kernel, that she had opinions and voiced them, was wildly exaggerated into treason. The rest was invented from nothing.
Why pornography specifically, rather than just political insult? Because in 18th century France, sex and corruption were treated as the same crime wearing different clothes. The press and the people of France associated sexual degeneration with political corruption, and explicit pornographic attacks on the Queen proved extremely useful for spreading revolutionary ideology about a corrupt monarchy and nobility. If you wanted to convince an illiterate population that the entire system of government was rotten, an abstract argument about taxation and representation wouldn't travel far. But a filthy story about the Queen's body, read aloud in a tavern, would travel everywhere. The pamphlets used cartoons, songs, alleged biographies, confessions, and plays, but her sexuality remained the dominant theme across all of them. always carrying explicit political implications. Her body became shorthand for the state's corruption. Every imagined orgy was an argument about taxation. Every fictional affair was a metaphor for misrule. She had been turned, against her will and without her knowledge, into the central illustration of an argument she had no part in writing.
The scale of distribution is almost unbelievable. According to the contemporary chronicler Boyer de Nîmes, anti-queen pamphlets were sold at the very gate of the Tuileries Palace, in its gardens, and directly beneath the king's own window. Imagine that. Pornographic literature about the queen's supposed crimes, hawked within sight of the room where she actually lived. This wasn't underground samizdat circulated in dark corners. It was, by the later years of the revolution, almost mainstream. Tolerated, even encouraged, because it served the new political order's purposes. Darton estimated that before 1789, only about 10% of pornographic libels targeted Marie Antoinette specifically. But from early 1789 onward, the vast majority of such publications took aim at the Queen. The numbers tell their own story. This wasn't organic gossip drifting through a population. It was a sudden, deliberate concentration of fire onto a single target, timed precisely to the moment the monarchy itself became politically vulnerable. Some of the libels took theatrical form, designed to be performed, not just read. Titles like L'Autrichienne en Goguettes or L'Orgie Royale, The Austrian Bitch and Her Friends in the Royal Orgy, and The Royal G, a 1789 opera whose frontispiece advertised exactly the kind of degrading royal fantasy its title promised, turned defamation into entertainment. People didn't just read about the Queen's supposed crimes. They watched actors mimic them, sang songs about them, laughed at them in groups. This is a crucial distinction from modern slander. A printed lie can be ignored or forgotten. A song, performed communally, becomes folklore. A play, watched in a crowded room, becomes shared memory, even when the events depicted never happened. By turning the Queen's invented sex life into popular theater, the libelistes ensured that the lies wouldn't just be read once and discarded. They'd be hummed in the street, repeated as punchlines, absorbed into the culture's bloodstream, as if they were simply common knowledge. Among the most vicious of these texts was Vie de Marie Antoinette d'Autriche, which didn't stop at imagining the Queen's own infidelities. It extended the fantasy to her close friend, the Princess de Lamballe. The pamphlet claimed that even during her final imprisonment, the princess put on lewd displays for her guards, masturbating with one hand while striking herself with the other, and that witnesses saw her produce a dildo from her pocket, fastened with a ribbon over her hips. Another passage from the same text claimed that since the revolution began, the monarchist club, embodied entirely by Antoinette's body and soul, had drawn endlessly from the vagina of the Austrian woman, calling that body an infectious cavern and the receptacle of all vices. This is not satire. This is not political commentary dressed in metaphor. This is grotesque sexual violence committed in print against two real women, one of whom, Lamballe, would later be murdered by a mob and mutilated, her head reportedly paraded past the Queen's prison window. The pamphlets didn't just damage reputations. They primed a population to see violence against these women as deserved.
Now, the most famous line associated with Marie Antoinette, "If they have no bread, let them eat cake." She never said it. The phrase, more precisely, "qu'ils mangent de la brioche," first appeared in print in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's autobiographical Confessions, finished in 1769, a full year before Marie Antoinette, then 14, even arrived in France from Austria. Rousseau attributed it to an unnamed great princess, and since she was completely unknown to him at the time of writing, she could not possibly have been his source. The line had previously circulated attached to other royal women entirely, including 2 daughters of Louis XV. It seems to have settled onto Marie Antoinette simply because she became, in effect, the last and most memorable great princess of Versailles after the monarchy's collapse, a convenient hook for a floating folk legend about aristocratic indifference. If revolutionaries didn't coin the cake quote, who attached it to her? The explicit linkage between the phrase and Marie Antoinette only emerged significantly after the Revolution, with the earliest known printed association traced to an 1843 issue of the satirical magazine Les Gapes, written by Jean-Baptiste Alphonse Karr, fully 50 years after her execution. Contemporary researchers have specifically searched for the phrase in newspapers, pamphlets, and other Revolutionary-era materials, and found no evidence the revolutionaries themselves used it as propaganda at the time. This detail matters enormously because it reveals something about how myths actually metastasize. The quote wasn't part of the original 1789-1793 character assassination campaign at all. It was a retroactive addition, decades later, slotted into an already established narrative of an out-of-touch, callous queen. Proof that the libelle's caricature had succeeded so completely that new fabrications could simply attach themselves to her afterward without resistance. What gets lost behind the caricature is who she actually appears to have been, based on her own letters and the accounts of people who knew her personally, rather than people selling pamphlets about her. Biographer Antonia Fraser has argued the cake quote would have been wildly out of character for a woman who, despite her own genuinely lavish lifestyle, donated generously to charitable causes and showed real sensitivity to the suffering of the French poor. Historians broadly agree she was an intelligent woman who, for all her extravagance, displayed real concern for France's starving population rather than indifference to it. This doesn't make her a saint. She was extravagant by any standard, politically active in ways that sometimes backfired, and slow to grasp how dangerous her public image had become until very late. But extravagant and politically clumsy is a different woman entirely from incestuous orgiast spy, and the gap between those two figures is the entire story of what propaganda can manufacture when it's allowed to run unchallenged for years. There's a reason political enemies chose pornography over, say, accusations of financial mismanagement alone. Sexual shame operates differently than political criticism. It doesn't require the audience to understand policy, economics, or law. Pamphlets and periodicals attacking the Queen were read aloud frequently in cafés and reading societies, spreading both the revolutionary message and hatred toward Marie Antoinette to the masses and the illiterate who couldn't access printed text directly. A story about a tax increase needs context to provoke outrage. A story about a queen having sex with her guards needs none. It bypasses analysis and goes straight to disgust. And disgust is one of the most durable and contagious emotions humans have. Once an audience feels disgusted by a person, they stop evaluating claims about that person critically. Disgust pre-sorts information, rejecting anything sympathetic and accepting anything damning. The libellists understood, intuitively, if not academically, that they weren't just spreading misinformation. They were installing an emotional filter that would make all future misinformation about her land instantly and stick permanently. When Marie Antoinette finally stood trial before the Revolutionary Tribunal in October 1793, the pornographic libelles weren't background noise to the proceedings. They were, in effect, evidence. Years of pamphlet biography describing her supposed orgies, espionage, and manipulation of the king had already constructed the public's working theory of who she was, and the prosecution leaned directly into it. Most infamously, she was accused,
based on coerced testimony from her own surviving son, a child not yet 8, of sexually abusing him. There was no credible evidence. The charge was monstrous on its face, but it was also, structurally, simply the logical endpoint of everything the Libels had spent years preparing the public to believe, that this woman's body and desires were boundless, perverse, and capable of anything. A population primed for years to imagine her in every conceivable sexual deviance did not balk at one more accusation, however baseless. The propaganda hadn't just damaged her reputation, it had built the very framework the tribunal used to convict her.
What's striking, reading accounts of the trial, is how little room existed for the truth to even be heard. When the incest accusation was read aloud, witnesses reported that even some of the women in the public gallery, ordinarily hostile to the Queen, reacted with audible discomfort, sensing the charge had gone too far even by revolutionary standards. Marie Antoinette herself, asked to respond, reportedly said she would not answer such a charge because nature itself would refuse it, appealing to instinct over argument, since rational rebuttal had no purchase against an accusation designed to provoke revulsion rather than belief. But by then, it scarcely mattered whether any individual juror believed the specific charge. The verdict had effectively been written years earlier, in the print shops of Paris and Holland, one lurid pamphlet at a time. The tribunal supplied the legal formality. The Libels had already supplied the public's verdict, long before evidence was ever presented in a courtroom.
It's worth noting that Marie Antoinette wasn't a uniquely targeted victim in some isolated sense. Pornographic libel was the standard weapon of the era's political combat. All political elites, revolutionary and royalist alike, received their share of erotic censure during this period. Mirabeau, Lafayette, countless ministers and nobles were all subjected to similar treatment in cartoons and pamphlets, sometimes depicting entirely invented affairs. One well-known cartoon, for instance, depicted Antoinette with the Marquis de Lafayette, despite there being no evidence of any affair between them, actually intended not as a sexual accusation at all, but as a visual shorthand for his perceived allegiance to the crown. This matters because it shows the genre wasn't reserved exclusively for misogynistic attack. It was a broader cultural weapon, used promiscuously against powerful men, too. What made Marie Antoinette's case different wasn't the existence of the genre, but its overwhelming, disproportionate concentration onto her, and the specific intensity and duration of the campaign once the revolution began in earnest.
Scholars examining this material today increasingly argue that the attacks weren't just about Marie Antoinette as an individual. They were about anxieties surrounding female power itself. Academic analysis of these pamphlets situates them within a broader theme: revolutionary France's threat perception around women occupying public political space. Her contested body became a representation of the monarchy's political culture and of women acting within the public sphere more broadly. And modern feminist scholarship has increasingly reevaluated her as a complex victim of her circumstances rather than simply an evil queen. A queen who merely existed quietly, bearing heirs and staying invisible, wouldn't have triggered this volume of sexual rage. It was specifically her visibility, her opinions, her spending, her perceived influence over the king that violated unwritten rules about where women were permitted to exert power. The pornography wasn't really about sex. It was a punishment mechanism for a woman who had stepped, however modestly, outside the boundaries her society had drawn around her. There's a darker function the Libels served, beyond simple humiliation. They manufactured public consent for what came next. It is far easier to watch a woman be executed if you've spent 4 years being told in increasingly explicit detail that she is a monster, an incestuous, treasonous, sexually depraved foreign agent draining your country's wealth between assignations.
The political implications embedded in even the most explicit pamphlets were never incidental. Sexual degeneracy and political corruption were treated as inseparable in the public imagination, which made pornographic content about the Queen function simultaneously as justification for revolutionary upheaval. By the time she walked to the scaffold, the crowd wasn't watching the execution of a flawed, real woman who had made real political mistakes. They were watching, in their own minds, the destruction of a fictional creature assembled from years of pamphlets. And fictional creatures can be destroyed without guilt. That, perhaps, is the libelle's most lasting achievement. Not just defaming her, but making her death feel deserved before it happened.
The men who wrote and printed those libelles are almost entirely forgotten. Most of the pamphlets themselves are obscure, accessible now only to specialist historians. And yet the caricature they built outlived every one of them, mutating across 2 centuries into new forms. By the 20th century, scholars like Antoine de Bake had thoroughly traced and debunked the cake quote's literary origins, confirming the misattribution beyond reasonable doubt. Yet, as one historian observed, these more balanced findings never reached the same audience as the false quote ever had. Playwrights, filmmakers, and journalists kept reaching for the line anyway, not because it conveyed factual information, but because its blunt clarity and cruelty captured something emotionally satisfying about elite indifference. This is the libelle's real legacy, not the specific lurid details, mostly forgotten now, but the underlying architecture of out-of-touch, callous, monstrous queen that those details built. An architecture sturdy enough that new, unrelated fabrications could be hung on it more than 50 years after her death and still feel instantly, intuitively true.
Even modern protest movements have reached for her invented words. Occupy Wall Street signs revived the cake quote to draw parallels between contemporary financial elites and historical aristocracy, treating a fabricated 18th century slander as though it were documented historical fact about class indifference. This is worth pausing on because it reveals something uncomfortable. The myth has remained useful precisely because it's emotionally satisfying, regardless of whether it's true. A real, complicated Marie Antoinette, politically clumsy, genuinely extravagant, but also documented as personally charitable and capable of real sensitivity to suffering, doesn't serve the same rhetorical function as a cartoon villain who explicitly mocked starving peasants to their faces. As one historian put it, audiences responded to the phrase not because it conveyed factual information, but because of the emotional weight it carried. And as a result, the historical Marie Antoinette effectively disappeared behind the theatrical version her enemies had created.
If we strip away the lurid content and ask what the libelle's sheer existence tells us, the answer isn't really about Marie Antoinette at all. It's about the mechanics of pre-modern mass persuasion. A society without broadcast media, without instant fact-checking, without any legal recourse for a defamed public figure of even the highest rank, was almost defenseless against a sufficiently motivated, sufficiently well-funded print campaign. The same dynamics, emotionally potent fabrication outrunning slower, duller correction, sexual shame deployed as political weapon against visible women, folk myths retroactively attached to convenient historical figures, recur constantly in modern misinformation, just with different technology. The libelles against Marie Antoinette aren't a strange historical curiosity. They're an early, unusually well-documented case study in something that has never stopped happening. Power discrediting inconvenient figures, not through honest argument, but through manufactured disgust, because disgust travels faster than truth and is immune to evidence once it has taken hold. None of this is an argument that Marie Antoinette was simply innocent, blameless, or wrongly persecuted in every respect. She was, by most accounts, genuinely extravagant in an era of real famine, politically influential in ways the absolute monarchy's own rules didn't formally permit, and slow, fatally slow, to grasp how thoroughly the public's perception of her had curdled until escape was no longer possible. She made real choices that real historians can legitimately criticize. But there's a vast difference between a flawed, privileged woman who mismanaged her public image during a genuine national crisis and an incestuous, treasonous, sexual deviant who personally orchestrated France's economic collapse from her bedroom. The first is a historical figure worth studying with nuance. The second is a pornographic fiction manufactured by named pamphleteers for explicit political ends that simply happened to share her face. And conflating the two does no honor to historical truth, regardless of which version of her you find more dramatically satisfying. She climbed those scaffold steps as herself, a mother who had just lost custody of her remaining children, a widow whose husband had been executed 9 months earlier, a woman who witnesses say walked calmly and asked forgiveness of no one but God. But the crowd below her, for the most part, was not watching that woman. They were watching the cumulative effect of roughly 15 years of pornographic libels, court scandal, and posthumous folklore, a fictional monster built specifically to make her real death feel earned. The historical record shows how thoroughly myth merged with reality in her case, reflecting the negative portrayal revolutionaries and the press constructed of her, rather than any documented truth about who she actually was. 200 years later, we still mostly remember the monster, the cake she never offered, the orgies that never happened, the incest that was never real. The actual woman, charitable and clumsy and frightened and human, remains comparatively unknown. That asymmetry isn't an accident of history. It's the propaganda working exactly as designed.
And it is still working today.
If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt. Before you go, thank you for staying until the very end. In a world of endless scrolling and short attention spans, you chose to spend this time exploring real human stories. That means more than you know. If these stories moved you, made you think, or helped you see the world a little differently, please subscribe and turn on notifications. It's the best way to support this channel and make sure more stories like these continue to be told. And if one of these stories stayed with you after the video ended, share it with someone you care about. One message, one repost can help these voices reach someone who needs to hear them. Leave a comment and tell me which story touched you the most. I read every one. Thank you for your time, your curiosity, and your heart. I'll see you in the next story. If you are a hunter, subscribe and join the hunt.